Welcome to another video in the eManage video training series. Now at this point you should be getting pretty comfortable with the basics of your cloud software. Things like adding machines, creating working locations, replacing products in those machines, and loading your data from your card reader, either manually or automatically. So in this video, we are going to walk through a little more detail about how that eData is processed and how you can verify that it was processed and do some additional analysis on it. So we're going to jump right into our eData tools section and go right to our raw eData screen. Now, as you probably know, the raw eData screen is one of the few screens in the software that does not automatically retrieve for you. It needs you to enter some search criteria so that it can pull back that information. Otherwise, it could end up pulling back a lot of data that you don't need. So what we're going to do is just that. We will start by pulling back all of our data. So I'll just click the search button without giving it any search criteria. And if you have a lot of data, it may take a little while for it to come back. So, for example, this is rows 1 of 250 out of a little over 2,000 records that came back. So, if you scroll all the way down, you're not done yet. You can page to the next page of data, and you've got the next 250 rows that you can kind of go through. Now, in any of the search windows, you can change the number of rows that you see by altering the number of rows per page here at the bottom, and then you'll just get that total number of rows on the pages that make up the entire result set. So just a little side note on this paging bar down here at the bottom. But as this data comes back, we'll notice that for the most part, everything has this status indicator here of processed. But as we scroll down, I think we notice that there's a few rows in here that say unlinked, like that one. So we're going to go through what does that mean? What's the difference between processed and unlinked, and the different statuses that you can have, linked only, processed, and unlinked. So we'll go through what each of those means, but before we do, let's go through what each of the columns in our raw eData screen is giving us. So jump back up here to the top. So the status column is the indicator that Toucan uses to let you know what happened with this row when it got loaded. Was it linked, not linked? Was it completely processed, not? That's what this status column is telling us. Then we've also got a processed date column. This is the date that the records were actually processed when we loaded them. And then they've got the eDevice ID, and you'll notice we've got some color variations. So these green rows, or the data that shows up in green, the columns rather, is the data that came in the ePort file. So either the automated file or the manual file, this is the actual data that was submitted. These darker colors are the pieces of data that Toucan put together for us while it did its processing. So we can see that in the file we get the device ID, which is the ePort serial number for each machine. We also get a transaction number and the date and time the transaction took place, as well as what type of transaction this was. And we have the options for a cash, credit, pay cards, or refunds. Alright, then our location, machine, and product, since it's the darker color, this is what Toucan is matching up for us. Then we have our coil, our price, and our quantity. This stands for raw coil, raw price, and raw quantity. They're in green, meaning that's what came in from the file itself. Then we have this M coil, or mapped coil, mapped price, and mapped quantity. Now the reason why we've got kind of some duplicated information here is there are some situations where the price that comes in is not the actual price that the product sold for. Likewise, the quantity that comes in isn't always the exact quantity that product sold. It's rare situations where this occurs. They're called multi-tender transactions. And we will go through what kind of transactions those are and how you can kind of identify them. But because they happen, Toucan will use the raw data, and then when it identifies a multi-tender transaction, it does a few things, and you'll see what it does using this mapped coil, mapped price, and the mapped quantity columns. The mapped coil column is really Toucan mapping the coil value that comes in from the ePort in case it's not mapped. So most of the time these two columns are going to look exactly the same like you see here. What can happen sometimes is if you get data from your card reader that is not mapped, instead of seeing the actual coil value like B6 and D6, you would see the motor number or the indicator, the code value for the coil, which could be something like 0341 or 01X2. So when Toucan encounters those codes, it will try to map that to the actual coil value for you and translate that for you here. So that's what the raw coil and mapped coil columns are for. Alright, now you'll notice we have a line total column, and this is not searchable, and that's because this is a column that Toucan will compute for you, and what it's doing is computing what the actual total amount for this line is that came in from the card reader. And again, this goes back to there are those rare situations where the price that comes in from the card reader isn't the actual price of the product that was sold. And so in those instances, Toucan will make its calculations and put that actual price here in the line total column as well. And then we have the transaction total. So this is what came in from the file, and this is the total amount of the transaction. Now most of the time the line total and the transaction are going to be the same values. But there are situations where they can be different. For example, right here we see we've got $1.75 for the line total and $2.75 for the transaction total. So, and there are some differences here. This is 60 cents and this is $2.30. So, what is happening here if we scroll back over to the left and we kind of keep an eye on those two rows right here, we can see that here's these two rows that came in, and they are the exact same transaction number and the exact same transaction date. So what this is telling us is we've actually had two products vended in a single transaction. So if we scroll over, we can see that one product was apple slices and the other one was grape juice. So it looks like one apple slice was purchased and two grape juices were purchased. So the two grape juices were purchased at 85 cents a piece, making that total of $1.70, and then one of the apple slices at 60 cents. So these products combined make the transaction total of $2.30. So that's where the transaction total can differ from the line total. Now because the transaction total gets duplicated, so for each one of the products that was in the transaction, we get a line in the file for each one of those products. The transaction total is duplicated on each of those lines, so you'll see it show up multiple times. That means that if we were to do a sum value on this column, we would not have an accurate indicator of the total amount of revenue that came in. So Toucan does not use the transaction total column here to figure out what the revenue is. Instead, it is using its line total column that it's computing to come up with the revenue number. Now the way that it computes this line total is if it's able to map the price and map the quantity. It's basically using the price times the quantity to get the line total. If it can't map the price and the quantity, then it will default to whatever the raw price and the raw quantity is and use that to come up with its line total. So then it can use the line total value and sum it here at the bottom to give us a more accurate indicator of how much revenue came in. Likewise, it uses the mapped quantity column and sums that column to give us a total number of products that were sold. Okay, The rest of these columns are probably self-explanatory. The card column, of course, is the credit card. You can see part of the credit card number that has come in. Description, MDB, and code. These are things that are used by the ePort itself, so they really don't have as much value to us, but they do come in the file, so they do get recorded there. And then Toucan is recording what kinds of device did this transaction come from, what was the data source, so in this case the file name that record came in, what type of data source was it, so a file in this case. Your other options are the FTP if it was an electronically submitted record. Then the date of that data source file. So this is the date of the file itself. Then you have some processing notes. And in the Toucan manual, there's an explanation about what some of these processing notes mean. So you can look in that area in the manual and it tells you kind of what you may see here in the processing notes area. The last thing is when this record was created. Okay, and that is pretty much what each one of these columns represent. Now you can query this data and do it very quickly. So for example, if we wanted to see all the refunds that came in, we could just look for refunds, query for those, and we get those coming back. So we can use our search criteria up here to do some querying. All right, back to this status column. This is kind of your indicator of did this data get loaded or not. So obviously if it's processed, what that means is Toucan was able to link all of the data up. And by linking, we mean it was able to find the machine, the location, and the product that was in the coil of the machine. So it found that, it was able to map the quantity, map the price, and then it was able to load that into the service history. So if we look in the service history area, and we'll pick a machine here, when data gets loaded from the card reader into your service history, it shows up in green. So we can see the very first row here is the row that we entered when we created this working location through the Toucan application. So that one goes in black. Then we loaded our electronic data into the cloud, and as it was loaded, it was processed. And when it was processed, things were linked together, and then it was able to load that into our service history and merge that with the data that we submit when we go out and fill a machine back up. So here's a row that came from Toucan. This is when we actually went out and refilled the machine and stocked it back up. Then we loaded more ePort data, went and serviced it again, loaded some more ePort data, and then we serviced it again and recorded that with Toucan, and that kind of begins to build that service history. So if a record is processed in your raw eData, it means it was loaded all the way into the service history. If it's unlinked, then it did not get loaded into the service history. It means that something didn't get linked up somewhere. So let's query this data again, and we want to pull back all of our unlinked records. So I'm going to clear the criteria to get rid of that refund, and now we're going to just query for unlinked and pull all those back. So out of all the data we've loaded, there are 234 records that are unlinked. And there are 3 basic reasons why something does not link up. So let's go through what each of those are. As we look at this first row here that's unlinked, the first thing we want to check is this device ID. So if we scroll over to see the location, the machine, and the product, these are the 3 main things that Toucan is trying to link up. On this first row, it was not able to link anything up. We can see that here it's at least kind of catching the machine. So what is the difference between those? And it's here in this device ID. So if we look in our machine list to see if we have a machine with this device ID, it probably means we don't have a machine at all with that device ID. We can check that by going to our machine list and looking down our eDevice column here, and we do not have that device ID at all in our machine list. So that's why nothing is linking up on that record. However, this device ID we did see for the HY009 machine. So if we go back to our raw eData, we do see that machine being linked up, and that's because the device ID matches that machine in our machine list. But that's as far as Toucan is able to get. It's able to match that machine, but doesn't see a product or a location or a product for it. And if we go back to our machine list and look at that machine, we notice there is no location, and the machine has no coils. Now this coils column and this location name column are columns that Toucan populates for us out of our working locations. So any machine that doesn't have a location name or is showing 0 for the coils, it's because probably there is no working location for this machine. So if HY009, if we go look at our working locations, and that machine does not exist as a working location at all. So that's why in the raw eData, Toucan is able to link up the machine, but it can't link up the location of the product because there is no working location for this machine. So how could we fix that? How could we fix any of this information? And for this first one, it's pretty simple. We would have to create the machine and create it with the device ID that's coming in here, and then use that machine once we have it created to then create a working location and populate the products in our working location, and then this data would link up. Let's go ahead and do that with this machine right here. So what I want to do to fix this is I'm going to create the working location for this machine, and then we'll tell Toucan to reload this data. So I'll go to my working locations, and I'm going to quickly create a new working location using that machine. We're going to say that machine's here at the Sports Lounge, and it's the HY009 machine. And I'm going to use a template so that this will be faster for me. Since it is at a sports location, I'm going to use my health gym template that I've created. So we'll load the coils. Alright, now I happen to notice, but forgot to point out, that those transactions that came in started coming in August 10th of 2016. So I would normally want to put my date and time as the actual date and time when I originally placed this machine, which should have been before August 10th. If we started getting transactions from our ePort on August 10th, it means we must have placed it either on August 10th or before. But I am going to make my date August 12th, just so you can see what happens and give you another example of why things don't link up sometimes. So we're going to say that we filled that machine up. So everything is now full, and I'm going to go ahead and save that working location. So that creates our working location. So now that machine is in there. Now if we go back to our raw eData, I have to tell Toucan to try to relink this data again. And the way that I do that is I say Reprocess Unlinked Records. So let's go ahead and click this Reprocess Unlinked Records. And what that does is Toucan will go through all of our records, and anything that is unlinked, it will try to link it back up again. You notice the number of unlinked rows went from, I believe, 234. Now we're down to 128. So they disappeared from our list. And that's because when Toucan re-retrieved this list, we had our criteria of unlinked. And since those records are no longer unlinked, they no longer show up in our list. But you do notice we still have some records from the HY009 machine that are still showing as unlinked. Those are the only ones now that show that way. And the reason they're showing up, as you'll remember, I used my service date of 8/12/2016, and these transactions came in on 8/10/2016. So any transaction from the HY009 machine that came in before that first date when I created that working location does not have anything to link to. Only records that came in after 8/12 have something to link to, and that's why these ones are kind of left out in the cold and didn't get linked up. If I would have used my 8/10 date, they would have been linked up. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's how you can correct these problems when you find them, is either the date of the transaction came in before that working location was created, in which case you can go change that date of the service date and make it for a previous service date to fix that. And you may need to actually create the machine and create the working location as well, so that this data will have something to link to. Alright, if we scroll down here, there's another record that's unlinked, but in this case the machine was able to be found based on the device ID, and it was able to link to a location as well. It just wasn't able to link to a product. And in looking at this record, it looks like this coil value that came in from the ePort is kind of a strange coil value. So 4B01 was the coil that came in, and Toucan wasn't able to map it, so it used the that actual data that came in and tried to use that to link up to it. If we go look at this location in our working locations, it's our OGO sports bag location. There is no coil 04B01, whatever that coil value was. So after Toucan has linked the location and it has found the location, it actually goes to the working location area and looks through the coils to try to find the coil that that record came in with. Couldn't find it, therefore it was not able to link up to the product. So to fix this one, there may be a problem with the board on the machine that's throwing some weird coil value, but that's a very, very rare instance if something like that happens. Most of the time what happens is the coil does come through here just fine, but I don't actually have that coil in the machine. So in those instances, what I would need to do is come back into the machine, find the coil, the missing coil, and create it. Or if I accidentally, for example, used a coil value like A01, and that's what I have in my machine is A01, those won't link up to the ePort data if the ePort data is coming in with a coil value of A1. So I would find that coil, make that change, save that, and then I can relink, reprocess those unlinked records, and then that data should link up. So ideally we would like to have all of our data processed, and anything that's not processed we can quickly come in here and query for it as unlinked data, and then determine based on what's not linking maybe what we need to go fix. The other option that we have in here is linked only, and that is something that we use when everything does get linked up and Toucan is able to find the machine, the location, and the product, but for some reason it's not able to create the service history for us in our service history area. So if we see linked only, then typically what we want to try to do is reprocess those unlinked records and see if that will just take care of those linked only records for us. Okay, the last thing we want to go over is what I mentioned here in our processed notes area. As I said before, inside the Toucan manual there is a description of what kind of messages can show up here in the processed notes area. One of them are those multi-tender transactions that we talked about earlier. So you can query this processed notes area to see if you are getting those kinds of transactions. So I can do a clear, and then in my processed notes area, by looking at the Toucan manual, I know what the message is. It happens to be multi-tender transaction. So I can just type in part of that message that's multi, and then tell Toucan that I want to see any notes that contain part of that message and retrieve those back. And that brings back all of my multi-tender transactions. So these are situations where the transaction came into the ePort and it's part cash and it's part credit. These ones can be kind of tricky, because if we scroll over here we can see, looking at the transaction numbers, these all look like separate, individual, and distinct transactions. They all come in with a unique transaction number, and they come in with a unique transaction date. Unlike when multiple products are purchased within one transaction, those records will all have the same transaction number and the same exact transaction date. But these, however, even though it is the same product being purchased in a transaction, it gets split apart, and it comes in looking like multiple transactions have come in. Typically, it is a credit and a cash, or a pay card and a cash type transaction. And if we scroll over here, we can see where the mapped quantity and price kind of come in handy in what Toucan is trying to do. So for example, an Honest Cola was vended, but part of it was a cash and part of it was a credit. And so the price gets split. $2.20 is not the price of the Honest Cola, and neither is the 5 cents. The actual price is $2.25, but the data that came in from the file has the different prices. Likewise, the quantity that came in makes it look like 2 Honest Colas sold, even though it was really only 1. So when Toucan can identify that, it makes that adjustment, and the mapped quantity then becomes only 1 actually sold, and then the other part of that split transaction gets set to 0. A lot of times on these transactions, you'll notice that it looks like they're about 5 cents off, but that isn't always the case. For example, we have a cranberry and almond kind bar that sold, and part of the transaction got split into 75 cents and part of it got split into $1. And that doesn't mean that somebody put 75 cents in and then finished the credit with $1. They could have put in 35 cents and then finished the rest with a credit card. Likewise, these ones up here, they didn't put 5 cents in, they may have put in 80 cents and then finish the rest with a credit card. So the cash and credit prices kind of get skewed a little bit on these multi-tender transactions. So Toucan does do its best then to actually compute what really was the sales price for that transaction and for that product, and then how many of those products actually vended. Even though it looks like 2 of them vended, really only 1 of them vended. And then it's able to figure out and compute that line total for these. So instead of 24 items vending, really only 12 vended. And we can total our line total here to actually get what the more accurate revenue amount is for these multi-tender transactions. So looks like my jet service hangar is one location and machine that sees more kind of activity like this than my other locations. And an example that I've actually seen is where if you have a location that has a lot of kids at that location, you'll get kids that will go up to the vending machine and just pull all the change out of their pockets and put it in the machine, and then start pushing buttons, and nothing vends because it's not enough. So then they'll go grab their parent and bring their parent to the machine, and their parent will just use the credit card to make up the difference. And so that's where I have actually seen these multi-tender transactions kind of take place, and they can be kind of tricky, but Toucan does do its best to identify when that happens and then makes the adjustments that it needs to keep your revenue and your quantity numbers accurate. Thank you for watching this tutorial, and I hope that you're able to get some good information out of it.